One book, one extraordinary life. 48 chapters of saints, science, and the search for God.
I'm Kai,
And I'm Maya.
and this is our take on Autobiography of a Yogi, chapter by chapter.
A scientist in Calcutta attaches a device to the tip of a fern, and on a screen, magnified 10 million times, you can watch the plant growing. Then he touches it with a metal bar, and the plant flinches. He gives it chloroform, and the plant stops moving entirely. He gives it an antidote, and the plant wakes up.
Chapter 8, India's Great Scientist, J.C. Bose. And this might be the most unexpected chapter in the book so far, because it's not about a saint or a yogi. It's about a physicist, a man with a laboratory and instruments and data, and what he discovers in that laboratory confirms what the yogis have been saying for thousands of years. Consciousness doesn't stop at the boundary of the nervous system. It goes all the way down.
So here's how Mukunda encounters Bose's story. He's walking along and overhears a provocative remark from a group of professors in a sidewalk discussion. Jagadis Chandra Bose's wireless inventions antedated those of Marconi, and that stops him. He walks closer. He admits his motive might have been partly racial pride, but he also felt a keen interest in evidence that India can play a leading part in physics and not metaphysics alone. "What do you mean, sir?" he asks.
And the professor explains. Bose was the first one to invent a wireless coherer and an instrument for indicating the refraction of electric waves. But the Indian scientist did not exploit his inventions commercially. Let that sink in. He invented wireless communication before Marconi, and he just didn't patent it, didn't commercialize it. He simply moved on. He soon turned his attention from the inorganic to the organic world. His revolutionary discoveries as a plant physiologist were outpacing even his radical achievements as a physicist. The professor adds that the great scientist is one of his brother professors at Presidency College.
So the very next day, Mukunda pays a visit to the sage at his home on Gurpar Road, which was close to his own house. He'd long admired the great scientist from a respectful distance, and the professor's remark gave him the push he needed to actually knock on the door. And the description of the man is wonderful. The grave and retiring botanist greeted him graciously. He was a handsome, robust man in his 50s, with thick hair, broad forehead, and the abstracted eyes of a dreamer. The precision in his tones revealed the lifelong scientific habit.
And Bose immediately tells Mukunda about his recent trip to Western scientific societies. Their members exhibited intense interest in delicate instruments of my invention, which demonstrate the indivisible unity of all life. The Bose crescograph has the enormity of 10 million magnifications. The microscope enlarges only a few thousand times, yet it brought vital impetus to biological science. The crescograph opens incalculable vistas.
And when Mukunda tells Bose that he's done much to hasten the embrace of East and West in the impersonal arms of science, Bose gives a response that reveals his dual nature perfectly. "I was educated at Cambridge. How admirable is the Western method of submitting all theory to scrupulous experimental verification. That empirical procedure has gone hand in hand with the gift for introspection, which is my Eastern heritage. Together, they have enabled me to sunder the silences of natural realms long uncommunicative."
And then comes the bombshell finding. The telltale charts of his crescograph are evidence for the most skeptical that plants have a sensitive nervous system and a varied emotional life. Love, hate, joy, fear, pleasure, pain, excitability, stupor, and countless appropriate responses to stimuli are as universal in plants as in animals.
And Mukunda makes a connection that thrills Bose. He says the unique throb of life in all creation could seem only poetic imagery before your advent, Professor. A saint I once knew would never pluck flowers. He said, "Shall I rob the rosebush of its pride and duty? Shall I cruelly affront its dignity by my rude divestment?" His sympathetic words are verified literally through your discoveries.
And Bose's response is one of my favorite lines in this chapter. The poet is intimate with truth, while the scientist approaches awkwardly. Think about that. The poet already knows what the scientist spends decades proving, but the proof matters because it brings the skeptical world along. Intuition and evidence working together across centuries.
Mukunda gratefully accepts Bose's invitation to visit his laboratory and takes his departure. He hears later that the botanist has left Presidency College and is planning a research center in Calcutta. And when the Bose Institute opens, Mukunda attends the dedicationary services. Enthusiastic hundreds strolled over the premises, and the building itself is remarkable. Its front gate was a centuried relic from a distant shrine. Behind a lotus fountain, a sculptured female figure with a torch conveyed the Indian respect for woman as the immortal light-bearer. The garden held a small temple consecrated to the noumenon beyond phenomena, and the thought of the divine incorporeity was suggested by the absence of any altar image. Even the architecture is teaching.
And Bose's dedication speech could have issued from the lips of one of the inspired ancient rishis. He said, "I dedicate today this institute as not merely a laboratory, but a temple." And then he described his journey. In the pursuit of my investigations, I was unconsciously led into the border region of physics and physiology. To my amazement, I found boundary lines vanishing and points of contact emerging between the realms of the living and the non-living. Inorganic matter was perceived as anything but inert. It was a thrill under the action of multitudinous forces.
And then the passage that really shook the scientific world. A universal reaction seemed to bring metal, plant, and animal under a common law. They all exhibited essentially the same phenomena of fatigue and depression, with possibilities of recovery and of exaltation, as well as the permanent irresponsiveness associated with death. Everything responds. Everything feels. Everything has a life pulse that can be extinguished.
And what makes this speech so extraordinary is that Bose is not just a scientist talking about data. He's a man who sees his work as fundamentally spiritual. He says the life of a devotee of science is inevitably filled with unending struggle. A devotee of science, the same word you'd use for a devotee of God. For Bose, the laboratory is a place of worship.
And he was honest about the resistance he faced. When he announced his results before the Royal Society in London, results demonstrated by experiments, the physiologist present advised him to confine himself to physical investigations. He had unwittingly strayed into the domain of an unfamiliar caste system and so offended its etiquette. Western academia had its own rigid hierarchies, and crossing disciplinary boundaries was not welcome. And there was what Bose calls an unconscious biological bias, which confounds ignorance with faith. The assumption that matter is dead, that only animals and humans have feeling, was so deeply embedded that proving otherwise felt threatening. But Bose persisted. Through many years of miscomprehension, he came to know that the life of a devotee of science is inevitably filled with unending struggle. It is for him to cast his life as an ardent offering, regarding gain and loss, success and failure as one.
Okay, and then the speech gets even more extraordinary. Bose talks about India's tradition of seeking the highest ideals not through passive renunciation, but through active struggle. The weakling who has refused the conflict, acquiring nothing, has had nothing to renounce. He alone who has striven and won can enrich the world by bestowing the fruits of his victorious experience. That sounds like it could come from the Bhagavad Gita, but it's a scientist talking about laboratory work. And Bose also talked about the instruments themselves. The long battery of super-sensitive instruments and apparatus of my design, which stand before you today in their cases in the entrance hall, they tell you of the protracted efforts to get behind the deceptive seeming into the reality that remains unseen. And then he says something that could have come from any of the yogis in this book. All creative scientists know that the true laboratory is the mind, where behind illusions they uncover the laws of truth. The true laboratory is the mind. That's pure Vedanta coming from a man with a Cambridge physics degree.
And then Bose made a declaration that connects him directly to the spiritual figures in this book. He said that all findings from his institute would become public property. No patents will ever be taken. The spirit of our national culture demands that we should forever be free from the desecration of utilizing knowledge only for personal gain. This man invented wireless technology before Marconi and chose not to profit from it. He built instruments that could revolutionize agriculture and medicine and gave them freely. And he opened the institute to workers from all countries, following India's tradition going back 25 centuries, when Nalanda and Taxila welcomed scholars from all parts of the world. Although science is neither of the East nor of the West, but rather international in its universality, yet India is specially fitted to make great contributions. He cited the burning Indian imagination, held in check by the habit of concentration, which confers the power to hold the mind to the pursuit of truth with infinite patience. And Yogananda writes that tears stood in his eyes at Bose's concluding words. Is patience not indeed a synonym of India, confounding time and the historians alike? And then Mukunda gets his laboratory visit. The great botanist, mindful of his promise, takes him to his quiet laboratory, and what follows reads like a scientific thriller. Bose attaches the crescograph to a fern. The magnification is tremendous. If a snail's crawl were enlarged in the same proportion, the creature would appear to be traveling like an express train. And Mukunda watches the magnified fern shadow on the screen. Minute life movements were now clearly perceptible. The plant was growing very slowly before his fascinated eyes.
And then Bose touches the tip of the fern with a small metal bar. The developing pantomime comes to an abrupt halt. The plant stops, and the moment the rod is withdrawn, it resumes the eloquent rhythms. You saw how any slight outside interference is detrimental to the sensitive tissues, Bose says. Watch, I will now administer chloroform and then give an antidote.
The effect of the chloroform discontinued all growth. The antidote revived it. Yogananda says the evolutionary gestures on the screen held him more raptly than a movie plot. And then Bose, in the role of villain, as Yogananda puts it, thrusts a sharp instrument through part of the fern. Pain was indicated by spasmodic flutters. When he passed a razor partially through the stem, the shadow was violently agitated, then stilled itself with the final punctuation of death.
The final punctuation of death for a fern, displayed on a screen, magnified 10 million times in a laboratory in Calcutta. And there's nothing mystical about it. It's pure data. The plant felt the touch, recoiled from the cut, and died from the razor, just like any animal would. And Yogananda writes that the evolutionary gestures on the screen held him more raptly than a movie plot. I love that comparison. He's watching the secret inner life of a plant like it's a film. And in a way, it is. It's the most dramatic film imaginable because it's showing you that everything you thought was inert is actually alive and responding.
And Bose keeps going. He tells Mukunda about successfully transplanting a huge tree by first chloroforming it. Usually, such monarchs of the forest die very quickly after being moved. He chloroformed a tree the way a surgeon anesthetizes a patient, because he understood that the trauma of being uprooted could kill it. And his instruments proved that trees possess a circulatory system. Their sap movements correspond to the blood pressure of animal bodies. A cylindrical tube extends down a tree and serves as an actual heart.
And then comes the demonstration that really pushes the boundary. Bose moves to a piece of tin. I will show you experiments on a piece of tin. The life force in metals responds adversely or beneficially to stimuli. Ink markings will register the various reactions. And Mukunda watches the graph recording the characteristic waves of atomic structure. Bose applies chloroform to the tin. The vibratory writings stop. The metal slowly regains its normal state. Then he dispenses a poisonous chemical, and simultaneous with the quivering end of the tin, the needle dramatically writes on the chart a death notice.
A death notice for a piece of tin. Let that land for a moment. The Western scientific tradition had spent centuries assuming that metals are inert, lifeless, dead matter. And Bose's graph is showing a death moment, which means it was showing a life pulse before that. The tin was alive in some measurable sense.
And Bose's instruments demonstrated that metals like the steel used in scissors and machinery are subject to fatigue and regain efficiency by periodic rest. The life pulse in metals is seriously harmed or even extinguished through the application of electric currents or heavy pressure. Metals get tired. Metals can be killed. That's not metaphor. That's measured, repeatable data. And that's the core teaching of the book, demonstrated with scientific instruments. Consciousness is fundamental. The universe is consciousness appearing as matter, not the reverse. Bose proved it with graphs and data. The yogis knew it through direct perception. Same truth, different methods. And Bose predicted that his cardiograph would lead to vivisection on plants instead of animals. Everything in man has been foreshadowed in the plant. Experimentation on vegetation will contribute to lessening of human suffering. Everything in man has been foreshadowed in the plant. That sentence alone could rewrite how we think about consciousness. If a plant can feel pain, if a piece of tin can die, then the line between living and non-living isn't a line at all. It's a spectrum. And at the bottom of that spectrum, consciousness is still there, just quieter.
And years later, Bose's pioneer plant findings were substantiated by other scientists. Work done at Columbia University in 1938 found that the long single cells of a freshwater plant called Nigella are virtually identical with those of single nerve fibers. The plant propagated electrical waves similar in every way to those of nerve fibers in animals and man. The Nigella plant became a sort of Rosetta Stone for deciphering the closely guarded secrets at the borderland of mind and matter. And Mukunda looked around the room at the numerous inventions, eloquent testimony of a tireless ingenuity. He suggested that Bose's instruments could be used for mass agricultural development to quickly test the influence of fertilizers on plant growth. And Bose agreed. Countless uses of Bose instruments will be made by future generations. The scientist seldom knows contemporary reward. It is enough to possess the joy of creative service.
And Mukunda leaves thinking, can the astonishing fertility of his genius ever be exhausted? And the answer was no. No diminution came with the years. Bose went on to invent the resonant cardiograph, an intricate instrument constructed with an unerring accuracy, by which a 1/100th part of a second is indicated on a graph. Resonant records measure infinitesimal pulsations in plant, animal, and human structure. He pursued extensive research on innumerable Indian plants. An enormous, unsuspected pharmacopoeia of useful drugs was revealed.
And here's something I find fascinating about Bose's place in history. The atomic structure of matter was well known to the ancient Hindus. One of the 6 systems of Indian philosophy is Vaiseshika. from the Sanskrit word meaning atomic individuality. The foremost Vaiseshika philosopher, Kanada, also called the atom eater, lived about 2,800 years ago. A summary of Vaiseshika scientific knowledge from 1934 noted that the modern atomic theory is generally considered a new advance of science, but it was brilliantly expounded long ago by Kanada. So Bose wasn't just bridging East and West in the present. He was revealing that Indian science had been asking these questions for millennia.
And his friend Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet and Nobel laureate, addressed him with beautiful lines, calling India's ancient land to return to steadfast work, to duty and devotion. Tagore called Bose a hermit scientist, urging him to send forth his call to India scholar band. Let them all gather, so may our India, our ancient land, unto herself return.
And Bose was eventually knighted for his crescograph and other inventions. But I don't think honors were what drove him. The scientist seldom knows contemporary reward. It is enough to possess the joy of creative service. That joy, the joy of creative service, is identical to what the yogis describe as karma yoga, selfless action performed without attachment to results. Bose was practicing yoga in a laboratory without ever calling it that.
And I think there's something profound about this chapter's placement in the book. We've just come from Badri, the levitating saint who said, "Do not mistake the technique for the goal." And now we have Bose, a scientist who would agree completely. His instruments are technique. The goal is understanding the unity of all life. The tools serve the truth, not the other way around. Next time, we meet a very different kind of teacher, Master Mahasaya, the blissful devotee, a man so intimate with the Divine Mother that he can predict what will happen in a room before it happens. And the house where he lives is the very house where Mukunda's mother died, 50 Amherst Street, where one mother was lost and another was found. See you next time.